All right. During the UFC in Abu Dhabi card this past weekend, the UFC announced what is, in my opinion, the best fight main event full card of the entire year in Max Holloway versus Ilia Topuria at UFC 308, which is also going to be in Abu Dhabi. And just looking at this card from top to bottom, I mean, it is stacked. From the bottom to the top, we have Jeff Neal versus Rafael Dos Anjos, Lerone Murphy versus Dan Ige. Ige, of course, coming off of, I'm pretty sure, the latest notice fight that has and probably will ever happen in the history of the UFC. Then we got Cyril Gane, who is deciding not to come back at the UFC's Paris card this year, but instead fighting Alexander Volkov in what is not even the co-main event for this card. And in the co-main, we get the fight that we were supposed to see not that long ago, which is another one of my most anticipated fights of the entire year. One of, in my opinion, the most exciting fights you can make out of all the fighters on the UFC roster right now. And Robert Whittaker versus Khamzat Chimaev, which is absolutely perfect because while we did get to see Whittaker get that amazing first round knockout of Ikram Aliskerov, that fight was kind of just cobbled together last minute. And the fight we all wanted to see was how Khamzat's able to fare up against some of the best at middleweight. So it turns out we're still getting that fight. And then, oh, by the way, the biggest cherry on top humanly possible, Ilia Topuria versus Max Holloway. I mean, I don't even know what else to say about this one. I honestly, legitimately cannot think of a fight that's gonna happen this year that I'm more excited to see. I mean, first of all, we got Max Holloway, one of the most exciting fan favorite fighters in the history of the UFC, going up against Ilia Topuria, a guy who already has one of the most exciting highlight reels you've ever seen. And then here we have Max Holloway coming off of, was it the best performance in the history of the UFC? I mean, this one is just a badass fight in every way imaginable. Usually when I give my breakdown videos in the lead up to a fight, I usually end it or start it with a prediction, but this one is really hard to call. I'm sure with a lot of people that are going to do breakdowns for this fight, kind of the most obvious thing that sticks out that you can point to is how the MMA math works out between the common opponents of these two. And of course, by common opponent, of course, I'm talking about Alexander Volkanovski. Of course, Max Holloway had not one, not two, but 3 fights against Alexander Volkanovski, each of which were very, very close up until the third one where he just kind of got blown out of the water. And looking back at all these fights, there were plenty of moments where Holloway was able to land some really effective shots on Volkanovski, but Volkanovski, despite being the shorter fighter, the shorter in height, shorter in wingspan, was able to close the distance and land some effective shots over and over, especially some of those boxing exchanges. And after some of these losses that Max had to Volkanovski, he was kind of forced to fight his way back into title contention, where Max went out there and put on some of the more exciting performances that we've seen from him in a long time. But ultimately, when Max finally was able to make his way back to that main event slot and fight for the belt, Volk put on one of the best performances that we've ever seen from him striking-wise and completely shut out Max Holloway. All the while, Ilia was out there putting on some of the most exciting performances we've ever seen, en route to making himself the clear-cut #1 contender at 145. And of course, now we all know exactly what happened when Ilia was able to finally get that title shot. So again, both of these guys are some of the most exciting strikers, striking heavy MMA fighters we've seen at the 145-pound division. I mean, for years, a lot of people have had Max Holloway as the GOAT at that weight class. And then when Volk gets into the picture and he's the one guy that's able to not only dethrone Max, but prove multiple times over again that in that head-to-head matchup, he's the better of the two. And then now we have Ilia knocking out Alex Volkanovski. Now, going up against Max Holloway, a guy who has lost to that same guy Ilia knocked out on 3 separate occasions. Of course, you can't always do MMA math. You're not always going to figure out who is the better fighter or even who's going to win a head-to-head matchup that way. And when you really break this one down statistically, there are some things that kind of just jump out off the screen to you. When you look at the head-to-head, tail-to-tape of this fight, there are a couple interesting things to look at. First off, I mean, the obvious thing is the height difference. Ilia Topuria being not much taller than Alex Volkanovski, maybe by like an inch or so. So he's going to have to deal with that similar height difference. And while he was able to close the gap with Volkanovski and land that shot that put him out, and obviously he was able to do the same to Jai Herbert, a guy that's significantly taller than him, but Max Holloway, when it comes to the stand-up MMA style kickboxing, is a whole different animal. One funny thing to note here is that even though there is a pretty large difference in height, their listed reach is the exact same. And then of course you've got the pretty big difference when it comes to experience. Max Holloway having 18 more MMA fights in his career than Ilia. And then Ilia Topuria being about 5 years younger, you kind of wonder who really has the edge here. Ilia being 15-0, you can always say that he doesn't really have much experience being the nail. He's used to being the hammer in there. Obviously, the exception is that knockdown he had early on in that fight against Jai Herbert, where we actually did see him be forced to get up off the canvas and still get it done. But we've yet to see Ilia in a situation where he's having to claw his way back after dropping a couple early rounds. So, well, the guy seems as confident as he can possibly be. You won't really know what he's like in those kind of situations until he's in one of those kinds of situations. And then for Max, while that experience is a major plus, Max has never been on the wrong side of a knockout loss. I mean, yeah, he's had some, TKOs in the past, but we've never seen Max truly get put to sleep. And when you see the kind of power that Ilia has, you got to think that that's a result that is very realistically on the table in this fight. And while you can always say that Ilia has the advantage going into this, because while you can always say Ilia has the momentum going into this, since he's coming off that big title fight victory over Volk, but let's not forget, Max Holloway is coming off of, again, one of the most impressive, one of the most exciting, one of the most unbelievable finishes in the history of the UFC. And all the points that I've made for why Ilia might have an advantage in this one, the fact that Ilia has crazy knockout power, the fact that Ilia has really good and really accurate hands, those same things can be said about Justin Gaethje, who was, oh, by the way, a weight class heavier than Max Holloway. And Max was still able to win convincingly and get the knockout. And this is coming from a guy in Max Holloway who was known for his volume, definitely not his power. So overall, man, if I really am forced to pick somebody to get behind in this fight, I would have to give a slight edge to Ilia, just because he doesn't have the same cumulative damage that Max has. So I got to imagine his chin's probably going to hold up a little bit more. Max doesn't appear to have as much knockout power as Ilia. So I'd have a hard time seeing Ilia get knocked out in this one. But of course, that volume from Holloway could force a TKO. I'm very interested to see if Ilia shows off his jiu-jitsu skills. The guy is a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt, even though, watching his fights, he always comes out with such an aggressive boxing heavy style, you would really never know it. But yeah, this is one of those fights where I'm a giant fan of both guys. I don't really want to see either one lose. And no matter who wins, it's a gigantic story. Max finally gets his way back to the belt, or Ilia stamps his ticket pretty early on into the featherweight GOAT conversation if he's able to get back-to-back finishes over two of the greatest of all time in the division, who are both either in their prime or, in the case of Volk, maybe had just started coming out of it. No matter what, I think this is going to be one of the most anticipated fights and one of the most exciting fights in a very long time in the UFC. And I think, to an extent, an argument can be made that whoever gets their hand raised at the end of this one may very well be well on their way to being the new face of the UFC. So there you have it. Let me know in the comments below. What do you guys think of this fight? Who do you guys think is going to get the victory when it's all said and done? And on a scale of 1 to 10, how hype are you for this card? Thanks for watching.